What is up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. We're going to try something new today, and that's tattooing one of these fake skins. I figured I'd start with a rose tattoo on this fake skin because roses are one of the most common tattoos in the world. I think there's a lot you can learn from this style of tattoo because no two roses are ever the same. Some are lighter, some are darker, some are more textured than others. It's one of those things that if you're into realism, they always make good practice. Alright, let's see what kind of damage we can do. So the first thing we're going to go over is how to apply a good stencil on this fake skin. So obviously one thing to keep in mind is this fake skin is a lot different than human skin. It's going to react in a lot different ways. The way that the needle hits, there's no bleeding, there's no swelling, and even applying the stencil has been quite a challenge. It's been a while since I've worked on a fake skin, so it was fun to kind of go back and see what worked best. What I did find that worked best for me was this Harry's deodorant. I'm not sponsored by Harry's. What's up, Harry? And I'm sure there are a few products that worked just the same, but this happened to work well for me. I tried some of the more regular stencil products, but everything just kind of bled together when I put the stencil on the skin. With this, I felt like I just had a little more control. So what we're gonna do before we apply the stencil is add a thin layer of deodorant across the skin. We wanna make sure we get the entire area covered. That way, we're not missing anything when we peel the stencil off. Now remember, this is going to take some trial and error. Every fake skin is different, and so is every stencil solution. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and lay down this stencil. So as soon as we lay it down, we're going to kind of press down firmly. We're going to make sure all sides of the stencil are getting pressed down on, and just make sure it doesn't move. Remember, this is going to be the foundation of your tattoo, so this isn't something that you want to rush through. We're just going to give it a second to let the ink stain the skin. Alright, the moment of truth. Not too bad. So normally you'd want to let this dry for an hour or two before getting started. I'd even recommend letting it sit overnight so it's truly dry. So in this case, I've got one prepared. I've went ahead and color coordinated my machine so you know which ones I'm using throughout the process. A lot of times for the solid black, I'll use my longer stroke machine or in tight areas that I want to lay down lines. In the petals, I'm going to be using my 3.2mm just because it has a softer effect. So we're going to work our way from the bottom to the top so we don't smear our stencil. And we're going to focus on blocking in the shapes rather than what this actually is. So I'm going to start with the longer stroke just so we have some harder edges around these petals. I'm using a 7 mag to start because I want that to be a little bit harder edge. We want to apply a little bit of cream so the ink doesn't stain the fake skin as much and it's easier to wipe away where we don't want it. So as I've said before in a previous video, I like to use 5 tones of black. From solid black all the way down to 2 drops of black with the rest being water. I use my solid blacks only where I see no visible light whatsoever. Those are in the deepest, darkest crevices and folds. And quite honestly, that's only about 3% of this actual tattoo. I'm going to use my second darkest cap on this part. I don't want it to be quite black. We're going to make sure that these petals have a nice, hard, crisp edge. And using that second darkest cap is going to allow us a little bit more freedom to push that ink around. If we use solid black, sometimes that's a little bit thicker and harder to use and harder to get some nice, crisp, clean edges. This is a little more versatile. Again, you just want to make sure that you have a nice, crisp edge for those petals. We can come back and add some texture later, but for right now, we just want to block off those shapes. And we can actually use a backstroke in this area to kind of fan away the ink, giving us a nice soft gradient. So right now we're kind of just etching in the bottom of this petal here. I don't want to add too much shading down here because this is the very bottom of the tattoo, and if I start to add a lot of shading, you're going to have to add a lot of shading everywhere, and then it becomes overwhelming. So you want to kind of just sketch in those lines. Just making sure they're barely there. As you can see, I'm rotating the needle around the entire section of that curve because you want to keep the shade consistent. Your main goal here is just to get in all the parts of the necessary stencil. You don't want to overdo it during this part of the tattoo. I'm just pressing hard enough to keep a placeholder. As I work my way in toward these folded petals, I switch over to a liner just so I can have more control with my edge. Toward the outside, I want to keep it slightly blurry. The focus you want to keep toward the middle, so as we work our way toward the middle, you want to switch over and do smaller and smaller liners. But on the outside, you want to keep it soft. So right now we're kind of just, again, building in those shapes, working on our form of the rose. We're not really pressing too hard, quite yet. In the darker areas, you can apply a little more pressure. One cool thing about working with realism is you don't necessarily have to pull these long straight lines as you would with a, let's say, traditional tattoo. You can actually kind of sketch in these lines as long as they're consistent and in the skin. Again, right now our main focus is just getting this stencil in here so we don't have to worry about smearing it later. When you're shading on the outside of the rose, you want to push out those shades as consistent as possible. Sometimes listening to music can actually help because you're going to move your hand in a consistent motion along with the music. You want to find the same rhythm all the way through. That's the idea. When we work on the inside of the petals, I switch over to my shorter stroke machine. This just helps eliminate needle strokes. I start on the edge of the petal and work my way in. This is where knowing a few different techniques can really help out. I start with a back shade, pulling away from the edge. You can push forward in these areas, but I find it a little bit easier to pull rather than push, so we're building the shape of our petals. If we push, sometimes we run into the risk of making these shadows too dark. So over here I can kind of push a little bit more because I'm pushing away from this dark edge. This bottom part of the petal has a dark shadow to it. So over here I can be a little more loose. I just always want to try to make sure I land on that line and push up from there. As you can tell, when we move forward, we're kind of building that curl of the petal. But again, you want to keep this a nice, smooth, consistent motion. The more you move, the more inconsistent it's going to look. As that shadow moves up, we can kind of extend our stroke and turn it more into a pendulum stroke, where it doesn't have one hard, definitive edge. It tapers just as much going forward as it does going backward. And as we come into that line again, we can just end up switching back over and pushing from there. So as you can see, there are 3 techniques that I've used on this petal alone to achieve such a soft shade. I've pulled, I've pushed, and I've used a pendulum stroke. To reiterate, I'm just trying to find shapes in those petals. There are some key features in the stencil that I'm putting in to use them as a placeholder. This fold right here, for instance. I'm just making sure I put it in there, and not as dark as it needs to be because I can always come back to it later. As I move to the next petal, I'm making sure to keep my light sources in check, always keeping in mind where the light source is coming from. So you always want to just make sure to constantly keep asking yourself that question. Where's the light source coming from, and where should those shadows be? So I get a lot of questions on why I use this stencil as opposed to a normal stencil or a printed off photo stencil. Well, if you were to use a printed off photo stencil, a lot of those details would be wiped away by now. With this sort of stencil, all these little tiny details stay strong and dark and last throughout several wipes, and I don't have to worry about them going anywhere. You don't necessarily have to use all these little lines, they're just there to help you along the way. For instance, this line here is actually that fold on the petal. This line here is the shadow of the petal that's sitting above it. It's always going to show you the darker side of where two tones meet. And as we get up closer to the center of the flower, we switch over to our 3-round liner just to kind of get in those tight little areas. These lines end up being a little sharper rather than blurry like the 9-liner or 14-liner, so we use them where we want to have the focus. These lines are a hair more important than the outside lines, so you want to make sure to take the time and do them right. The areas where the folds aren't that strong, I'm kind of just sketching them in again as I don't want those lines to be super sharp. But when we get back to those darker areas, we can apply a little more pressure to make them more bold and clean. Also, that's where our eye should be drawn, so we want to make sure that those details are nice and sound. Again, we're keeping the same process throughout this entire tattoo. We're just etching in the areas that we need to keep. That way when we wipe the stencil away, those areas are still there. I kind of work my way up and then back down to add more details, and then work my way up and then back down again, and I repeat that process throughout the entire thing. Working back on the outside, I'm just whip shading it up to have a nice gradient so it kind of disappears into the skin tone. Now we're going to focus on the shadow on the left side of this rose, the one that starts in the dark area and folds its way over to the light. I start by giving it a nice back shade into the center of the rose, following the path of that petal, and that's easy to see from the dots created by that stencil. Again, we're just blocking out shapes here. We can always go back later and darken things up. As we work our way around this petal, we want to make sure to keep our needle in motion with the flow of that petal itself. What I mean by that is, when we go around that curve, we want to move our hand and our needle around with that petal as well, keeping that same flow of motion. Always paying attention to our reference, just to make sure our direction of movement is accurate. You might not be able to see it, but I have my iPad here as a reference so I can look whenever I need. I like to have my reference as close as possible and the same angle of the tattoo. That way my eyes aren't fighting to distinguish the shapes of the tattoo. As we get toward the center of this rose, this is an area that you really want to take your time, and you don't want to rush through this. This is the area where your eyes are going to be drawn to, so these little details matter the most. I'm using a punchier machine to make sure those details get in there the first time. The more I go over these lines in the center, the higher the risk is of blurring those lines, making them not as crisp. So you want to make sure you take your time, but also get those details in there right away. It's important to know the capabilities of your machine as well as the needles and what they're designed to do. So dealing with practice skins like this really allow you to try out different machines, different techniques, and different needle groupings. And it really allows you to build that muscle memory. When I've pretty much got the entire perimeter of everything I need tattooed into the skin, I'll bounce around and just kind of feather in those lighter areas of the stencil before they fade away. I'm sure you guys notice that I like to bounce around a lot, and I don't really have any sort of explanation for that. I just get a feeling, and if I see something that needs to be worked on, I work on it. That's it. I'm introducing some darker shades into the center of this flower just to give it some nice depth and clarity. At this point, you can take a 3-round liner or something finer and work your way around the entire rose, putting in those details that you see throughout the reference. I don't know if there's like maybe some stencil stuff on it or something. I don't know what else I can use to remove that shit. Fingernail polish remover? So there seems to be a couple stubborn areas of that purple stencil. It doesn't really want to come off at that top area right here. So I'm expanding that background just a hair to kind of help mask that purple stencil and also highlight these petals just a bit more. If you have an easier way to remove or apply this stencil, let me know in the comments below. Well, at some point you gotta call it quits, but I do think we got through quite a bit. So a few of the things that I think are important when doing a realistic rose tattoo like this are, don't worry about your outlines being so dark at the beginning of the tattoo. So you just want to make sure that those outlines are there enough to build off of. When you look at a rose in person, you don't see a black outline around that rose, but you do see an edge. And depending on where your eye is focused, that's going to be a clean edge or a blurry edge. And you can control those edges with a couple of the techniques we talked about today. Using the edge of your mag and putting it in a different direction can really give you lots of versatility. And don't be afraid to use those liners as shaders, especially in cases such as roses, where they have have a lot of wrinkles and folds. Also, pick your point of focus. Not everything has to be sharp. Some lines are gonna be softer than others, and that's okay. But where you want your eyes to be drawn is where you want your lines to be the sharpest. One last thing to keep in mind, you can always go darker, but you can never go lighter. You wanna layer in your shadows a little bit at a time. This will help you achieve the shape of what you're trying to pull off as well as a softer blend. Alright, I hope this helped you guys in some way, shape, or form. This was pretty new to me, and I think I learned quite a bit. If you guys have any hints or tips to help me out with these fake skins, leave them in the comments below. Whether that's putting on or removing a stencil, this stuff's pretty difficult to work with. It's been a while. But before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, as it doesn't cost you a thing. If there's anything that you would like to see a tutorial on, let me know below. Help me! Alright, see you next time.